the phase-shifting universe model, or PSUMOT. This framework attempts to unify the dynamics of the entire cosmos, dark matter and dark energy, with the fundamental mechanics of consciousness itself, all through the lens of a single quantum superfluid substrate.
It is undeniably a beautiful theoretical achievement. I mean, it weaves together threads of cosmology, quantum mechanics, and deep psychology. But its reach is vast, maybe too vast.
Indeed. And the central question we really need to address is whether the PSUMOT framework, particularly when you look at it against recent anomalous astronomical findings, offers a coherent and predictive path toward a deeper understanding of reality, or if its highly speculative synthesis just overreaches its current empirical justification. I'll be arguing that new structural and observational data not only validate PSUMOT's theoretical coherence, but actually demonstrate its necessity.
Right. And I will argue that while the model handles cosmological anomalies with a certain grace, the conceptual leaps required to integrate this quantum receiver concept, the idea that our brains somehow filter universal consciousness, well, they remain far too speculative for us to accept the whole theory as a unified explanation of reality.
Okay, so let us establish why this framework might even be necessary. The standard cosmological model, the lambda CDM, it's facing what you can only really call a crisis of fragmentation. We see persistent, debilitating anomalies, the Hubble tension, where expansion rates just don't match up, or the coincidence problem where dark energy seems to appear at just the right cosmic moment, that signal the model's fundamental insufficiency. PSUMOT elegantly resolves this by defining the universe as one dynamic, vast quantum ocean. That's a helpful analogy, certainly, for listeners trying to picture it. It's essential, really. In PSUMOT, dark matter isn't some missing mass we can't find. It's the superfluid substance of the ocean itself. Dark energy is its macroscopic universal current, the tide driving accelerated expansion. And gravity? Well, gravity is simply the local disruption, the drag or the whirlpools, if you will, caused by matter interacting with this flow. This dynamic, fluid-based reality structurally predicted something that classical models completely failed to explain: the findings from the Juno mission regarding Jupiter's core.
The finding about Jupiter's core was certainly anomalous, yes. A serious challenge to planetary formation theory.
That day was more than just a challenge. It was a structural failure of classical reductionism. Jupiter's core was found to be fuzzy, dilute, and non-convective. Standard core accretion models demanded a dense solid nucleus. PSUMOT, which is rooted in emergent fluid dynamics, predicted that a universe fundamentally made of this flowing superfluid substrate would yield such diffuse, dynamically structured phenomena. This is the strong structural validation I mentioned, an independent prediction confirmed in observed data. And it is here that the physical asymmetry of the cosmos, like the quantized vortices predicted in the superfluid, links directly to conscious experience, positing that consciousness is a fundamental interaction with this flowing universal current.
Okay, I see why you find that specific prediction compelling. It certainly forces a change in how we view planet formation, I grant you that. However, I come at this from a slightly different perspective. While PSUMOT is theoretically elegant in resolving those cosmological headaches, for instance, bypassing the catastrophic cosmological constant problem through the dynamic negative pressure of fluid flow, the point where it transitions from physics to metaphysics is, well, that's its most vulnerable spot.
You mean the consciousness aspect?
Precisely. The really radical tenet is that the brain acts as a quantum receiver, or maybe a filtering transducer, of this universal field. But this transducer, it lacks a clear mechanism. How does the signal work? What's the transmission medium specifically? And critically, this model struggles profoundly with what philosophers call the combination problem.
Right, the combination problem.
For those unfamiliar, it's the difficulty of explaining how all these decentralized micro-experiences, whether it's, distributed intelligence in bacteria, or maybe plant cognition, how do they suddenly aggregate or combine to form one singular, unified macro-consciousness like we experience in humans? PSUMOT suggests the fluid provides the link, sure, but it never quite gives us the hardware specs, so to speak, on how the self is actually assembled. Furthermore, the theory's claims about heightened perception, like this theoretical possibility of enhanced human vision approaching, 35 nanometer resolution under neuroperceptual enhancement, these are currently just theoretical possibilities. They're challenged by known physical limits, like the baseline diffraction limit of light itself.
And the attempt to unify internal psychological states like nostalgia and déjà vu just based on overlapping activated brain regions. Well, that seems to confuse psychology with cosmological interaction.
Okay, let's focus back on the hard data for a moment and the structural necessity. How can we possibly dismiss PSUMOT as purely speculative when the Juno findings about Jupiter's fuzzy core directly contradict the standard core accretion model? The physics of a dilute core necessitates a model based on fluid dynamics, which is the foundational assumption of PSUMOT. Doesn't this single, very concrete data point shift the burden of proof away from PSUMOT and, frankly, onto the established but currently failing lambda CDM?
That's an interesting point, though I would frame it slightly differently. Jupiter's core anomaly is primarily a challenge to planet formation theory, and we do have viable, non-superfluid alternatives. For example, the hypothesis that a massive shattering collision early in Jupiter's history caused the mixing and dilution of the core material. Now, that explanation doesn't require overhauling all of physics just to integrate consciousness. PSUMOT's attempt to bridge this planetary anomaly to conscious experience relies on concepts like chiral asymmetry, which we know is crucial for life's fundamental structure granted, and morphiconic resonance.
And what exactly is morphiconic resonance in this context?
Well, that's the thing. It's the hypothesized mechanism, which has never been empirically tested, by which these information patterns, the form or morpho, supposedly transfer across the superfluid substrate. To take chiral asymmetry, which dictates why all biological life uses left-handed amino acids, and then use that concept to connect Jupiter's physical state to the global structure of consciousness, well, currently that feels like an analogical leap, not a tested physical law.
But the connection is physical and informational, derived directly from the superfluid nature of the substrate itself. If consciousness interacts with this superfluid current, then observation itself becomes a coherent disruption in the flow. This explains why highly altered states, like those induced by, let's say, neuroperceptual enhancement, allow the observer to access what seems to be reality's deeper informational substrate. We can see the physics of this informational interaction reflected in extreme cosmic dynamics, which brings us to the profound link between space, time, and the observer's frame.
You're referring to the established physics of gravitational time dilation near black holes.
Exactly, but reframed through this superfluid lens. General relativity predicts that time for a local observer, say an astronaut falling into a black hole, can pass at a normal rate, fine. But an external observer sees that astronaut's time slow down dramatically, effectively stopping right there on the horizon. This is the inversion of space and time roles, where the black hole's singularity becomes, in a sense, a moment in time rather than a place in space. This supports the idea that the observer's frame dictates the temporal experience.
Okay.
Now, this physics, when scaled down, potentially explains the subjective experience of consciousness. If time is truly dependent on the observer, then a person undergoing neuroperceptual enhancement, someone experiencing, say, timelessness during a DMT trip, is simply operating within a different temporal place in that fluid reality. Their buddy sitting across the room perceives 5 minutes pass normally, confirming they are in different temporal frames. Why? Precisely because the superfluid allows for this observer-dependent temporal reality. Now, if both were somehow in the black hole, yes, they would both fall through time, forever being squished from three-dimensional space into two-dimensional time. But the difference in experience highlights the power of the singular observer's frame interacting with the current.
I see why you find that line of reasoning so compelling. The analogy is incredibly elegant, I'll give you that. But applying that well-understood prediction of general relativity, which deals with immense gravity, to altered human perception, well, it requires proposing immense, non-local, non-gravitationally bound quantum entanglement within the brain, far exceeding anything we've actually observed. To connect the physics of a black hole event horizon to a momentary subjective state requires that the brain functions akin to the holographic principle, this idea that our 3D reality is somehow projected from 2D information. That is a massive theoretical demand.
I'm just not convinced by that line of reasoning, because the observation as interaction idea, suggesting consciousness as a measurable, coherent disruption in this superfluid, it's currently unsupported by controlled experimental research. Even the early research you alluded to into, say, psychic phenomena using card guessing under psychedelic conditions, the very context you describe, it showed no statistical significance. If consciousness truly interacts with this current in a measurable way, we should have some reliable, replicable empirical proof by now, regardless of the enhanced state.
Okay, but that brings us to the core epistemological issue, doesn't it? Which is highly relevant to consciousness as a receiver. PSUMOT describes everyday reality as a hallucination, even a collective parallax error, resulting from rigid adherence to one-sided viewpoints, a kind of chiral bias in thought. This raises a profound risk, I agree, confusing genuine delusion, a fixed false belief contrary to reality, with an hallucination, a false sensory perception.
Exactly. If consciousness is merely a quantum receiver filtering information from this universal field, how can we empirically distinguish between, say, a collective outbreak of madness, which the psychoanalysts Carl Jung warned could result from repressing the irrational elements of the collective psyche, and a genuine, enhanced perception of these unseen worlds, the level 4 parallel universes that PSUMOT posits are physically real structures within the superfluid? We risk confusing mental pathology with cosmological truth.
That's a compelling argument, but have you considered that the distinction is precisely what PSUMOT overcomes by rooting both delusion and potentially real hallucination in the universal information substrate? The theory suggests that the perceived stability of reality relies entirely on collective belief, on consensus. When our language and our science, like the lambda CDM model, artificially separate naturally unified neural phenomena like nostalgia and déjà vu, which you mentioned share extensive brain region overlap, it creates systematic preconditions for collective false memory formation and maintains this fundamental parallax error, this biased view. When that collective belief breaks down, perhaps under specific conditions, the consensus reality breaks down too.
But this seems to dangerously conflate psychological reality with physical reality.
They are inherently intertwined by the superfluid, according to the model. The mirror world dimensions, or unseen worlds that PSUMOT posits, are physically analogous to the quantized vortices in the superfluid. These chiral, spinning disruptions are the physical expression of the fundamental asymmetry required for life, the very same asymmetry that arguably drives the fluid dynamics observed in Jupiter's core. Thus, the theory suggests that the delusional states, or the hallucinatory one, is merely a reflection of a fluid, information-based construct that is constantly shaped by interpretation and observation. This justifies the critical skepticism needed to perhaps recover the long-lost truth of an integrated system that classical thinkers like Newton were searching for. This is why the lambda CDM model is fundamentally insufficient. It's predicated on the assumption that the world is stationary and can only be accurately measured through effects derived from sight and touch. But if we accept that fundamentally we actually touch nothing ever, that forces keep atoms apart, and it's maybe no wonder our measurements never seem quite accurate when dealing with dynamic phenomena like dark energy or planetary core dynamics. If the observer's frame dictates time itself, then any model that ignores the observer's interaction with the system will inevitably produce inaccurate measurements because it assumes a fixed, stationary world.
It is a profound philosophical argument, suggesting that our entire epistemological stance might be inherently flawed if we fragment reality based on language and limited sensory input. I understand that.
But the theory still requires us to accept that these complex, highly structured systems, like the precise geometry of mirror worlds or the action of morphophonic resonance, exist without direct, repeatable, non-subjective observation. The concept that reality is merely a fragile construction based on collective belief, well, it risks placing true, verifiable scientific knowledge on the same level as collective delusion or shared hallucination.
So, to summarize my position, I maintain that Jupiter's core is a critical, observed piece of evidence challenging the established classical model in a fundamental way. PSUMOT provides a singular, arguably elegant explanation that unifies cosmic flow, dark energy, and localized interaction, gravity, structurally positioning consciousness as an integrated participant. The framework, including its necessary use of superfluid dynamics and concepts like morphonic resonance, structurally moves us beyond fragmented physics toward a potentially unified theory.
And while I acknowledge the theoretical coherence and the explanatory power of PSUMOT regarding cosmological anomalies are indeed strong, its core claims regarding consciousness as a quantum receiver remain, for me, the most speculative component. The theory relies on highly abstract frontier physics concepts like the holographic principle and, frankly, analogical leaps between planetary anomalies and neuroperceptual shifts. The path from the discovery of Jupiter's fuzzy core to the necessity of believing in enhanced perception of unseen worlds or observer-dependent time in the human brain, well, it requires robust, controlled empirical validation that the source material, compelling as it is, does not yet definitively provide.
The evidence, I think, compels us to recognize that our epistemological stance, our viewpoint, our parallax, is an inescapable part of the reality we perceive. The fluidity implied by the Jupiter core data alone forces us to reconsider the stationary, classical assumptions underlying our current models, whether or not one fully accepts the entire consciousness framework of PSUMOT.
Agreed. The question remains open. Is PSUMOT an accurate description of a fluid, information-based reality that truly overcomes the limitations of our current sensory-based science? Or is it simply the strongest, most integrated version of a highly speculative theoretical framework currently available? There's clearly much more to explore, much more to test, in this material before any scientific consensus is likely to shift.